The Cupra brand has been showing off a lot of new models lately. Check out our channel to see the latest Formentor and Leon models, but this is perhaps one of its most important models. It's the Tavascan. It's the second fully electric Cupra to come to the market, and it really is a sporty alternative. It's obviously designed to compete against things like the Skoda Enyaq Coupe, the Volkswagen ID.5, and it uses the same underpinnings as those. There's going to be two different versions available of this. Both will use a 77 kilowatt hour battery, and the driving range will vary between 512 and up to about 550 kilometers depending on which version you choose. The rear wheel drive gets a 286 horsepower output with 545 newton meters of torque, while the all-wheel drive version gets a slightly higher power output. That's badged as the Tavascan VZ, which is what we're driving today. That has 340 horsepower, but it also has the same 545 newton meter torque output. The reason is it only drives the front wheels when it's needed. So when grip and traction is losing on the rear, it'll send up to 134 newton meters of that 545 newton meters to the front axle and give you all-wheel drive. Now I want to talk about styling for just a moment, because this thing, I've got to say, it does look really, really good, and it's got a couple of pretty interesting features on it. First of all, the headlights. They're the usual LED headlights we see these days, and it has this triangular arrangement, which if you've seen our videos on the latest Leon and Formentor, you'll see this is kind of the new look that Cupra is using for its headlights. But it does have one interesting thing. It also illuminates the badge on the bonnet. Now, that's not the first time that's happened, but Cupra has managed to very cleverly work around the legislation. That means they can have this on all the time because it's basically classified as a position light on the car. You'll see that you have your normal headlights. There's also illuminated strips underneath here, and that illuminated strip is connected to that, and because there is a 75mm gap between them, I know this is quite nerdy, but stick with me, it means that this can be illuminated all the time. It's a very nerdy thing. It's a great way that Cupra have actually interpreted the legislation, and I tip my hat to them for doing it. There's a range of wheels available ranging from 19 to 21 inches, and when you see the side profile, you can see how different this car looks from some of the siblings in the Volkswagen group. Got quite a raked windscreen here. I think there's actually, when you look at this part of the car and the roof and how it comes around, I think there's a little bit of Polestar 2 in there as well. No bad thing though, because this is pretty good looking. You've got flush fitting door handles. Your charge port is here. I'll quickly talk about charging because it gets 11 kilowatts AC as standard and 135 kilowatts DC. Now, 135 kilowatts isn't necessarily the highest charging speed, and I did query this because Cupra also has updated the Born VZ, and that has 50 kilowatts more. That has a 185 kilowatt charger, and I asked them, said, why have you given this a lower charging rate? The difference is this has a longer rate of charge, so the charging curve is different on it. So although it doesn't have as high a peak, it can maintain a charge for longer, which means it can go from 10 to 80% in about 28 minutes, which is pretty much what you'd expect for that. Around the back, there's no wiper on the back, which is something I'm not always a fan of, but they reckon the aerodynamics will clear all the window off. There's a nice little lip spoiler here, and when you see it right from the back, another thing that they have is that the Cupra logo is illuminated because it's all part of this one panel with the taillights that wrap all the way around. Again, you have this triangular design. It's very intricate when you get up quite close on it. It's a very nice piece of design. A lot of detail has gone into that. You've got the illuminated Cupra logo, you've got Cupra across the back, VZ to determine that this is the sportier version with more power. But interestingly, it's on the number plate, but it doesn't actually say Tavascan anywhere on the outside of the car. You've still got a very sporty looking high gloss black diffuser here. Again, really adds to that sporty look, but this is also going to be quite a practical car. Despite the sporty profile, this still has a 540 litre boot, which is pretty good for a car in this class. It's a nice open area, very easy, good load level to get in here, and you've got 60/40 split folding rear seats as well. On the inside, Cupra, I have to say, you've done a very good job in designing the interior. The layout and look of it is very nice. Obviously, it's a very digital experience as you'd expect. There's a 15-inch display here, angled around towards the driver. Crisp graphics, it looks very good. You've got all the usual sort of features there as well. You've got Apple CarPlay, Android Auto. You can go through all the different settings. As we've now seen from the Volkswagen group, these are now illuminated across the bottom, so you can see your temperatures, your volume control, and these essential items are always shown at the bottom of the screen. So temperature, your heated seats, climate control, and all that sort of stuff is always on display. The native infotainment system is quite good. Again, nice high quality graphics. The driving position itself has also got quite a bit of adjustment in it, first of all. So the seats are electrically adjustable, lots of space for maneuvering there. You've also got a reasonably good amount of reach and rake here in the steering wheel. So again, finding a driving position is going to be quite good. The gear drive selector has moved onto a stalk, a la what we've seen in some of the other electric models like the Volkswagen ID Buzz. That means it's no longer attached to this display up top as it was in the Cupra Born. So you now have this freestanding 5-inch display here. It's a decent size. All the information is right there that you need, but Cupra does also give you a color head-up display as well. So this is quite a well-equipped car. Okay, the haptic controls on the steering wheel perhaps aren't the best thing in the world, but they're okay in terms of the layout. And then you've got 2 satellite buttons here as well to pick your different drive modes. And there's also a Cupra button which directly puts you into the Cupra mode. One other thing I quite like is the layout of this dashboard. You've got this kind of comes down in this almost spine V shape here. You've got this kind of almost like a scale pattern imprinted in it as well. It looks quite nice. Your hazard button is just there, but of course you still have all that space open behind. You've a wireless charging pad. You have 2 cup holders here. They are a little bit on the small side and they're right next to each other. But you know, you've got this kind of nice kind of foamy felt material here. There's storage space underneath here as well, which is not bad. You've got a USB port in there as well. But yeah, okay, decent enough quality. There are a few parts of the cabin, if I'm honest, that do feel a little bit cheap in terms of the plastic materials, but they've tried to cover it up as best they can. Most people, if I'm honest, are probably going to find it okay. There are some nice details, I'll be honest. The very slender air vents here that are nicely positioned, they really do a good job of hiding those away. You've got the copper finish here again, and you see this kind of vent material or vent design runs all the way right out, but you still have this kind of color and material that runs all the way through in the center. Overall, it's got a good amount of space inside. It does feel quite roomy. The seats are very nice as well. Nice quality finish to them, a lot of intricate detail. I do wonder how these will wear over time when these are a few years old, but the materials are good. Some nice detailing put throughout, and you've got a full panoramic glass roof as well. In the back seat, there's quite good amounts of passenger space here too. Even though you've got that full glass roof and there's a blind, there's still a decent amount of headroom available. And sitting behind my driving position, I still have quite a good amount of leg room here, knee room. I can get my feet in underneath the seat in front as well. And overall, it does feel quite spacious. Now, I'm a fairly average height. I'm about 5'9". I don't have particularly long legs, and I find this quite comfortable. There's a nice amount of support underneath here as well. And you do have an almost entirely flat floor across the bottom here. The middle seat, as is often the case, it is a little bit less comfortable because it's a bit flatter here. And this rear center console does extend a little bit further, so it does slightly take in to the amount of space you have. But for 2 people back here, very, very comfortable. You've got air vents, you've got heated outer rear seats available, you've got 2 USB-C ports. If you're not using the middle seat, as usual, you can pull down an armrest with 2 cup holders in here as well. There's also a storage area here, so you can actually then reach through if you do need to get in access to the boot. And of course, you have ISOFIX points in the 2 outer seats as well, so you can get 2 child seats in here as well on the back. Cupra has also made some chassis setup changes to try and differentiate the Tavascan from the ID5 and the Enyaq Coupe and things like that. So apart from how it sets up its adaptive dampers, it also lowers the ride height by 15 millimeters on the front axle and 10 millimeters on the rear axle in comparison to the Tavascan's equivalent model in both the Volkswagen and the Skoda range. Now, those changes might not be all that immediately obvious to people, but it does all help in terms of how the car sits on the road and also particularly how it performs through corners. Now, this thing does corner, as I'm doing right now, pretty flat. Certainly there's no real body roll to complain about, and it is set up a little bit more with sportiness in mind rather than outright comfort. Now, you can go through the settings and change that, and there's actually an individual mode where you can actually make it, you know, stiffer if you want, or if you want to soften things up, and you can go through and set up quite a lot of different things with it. So everything from the steering feel to the engine responsiveness, even the ACC. So all those parameters can be changed in the into the individual mode. With the all-wheel drive version as well, because it has the ability to drive the front and the rear wheels, you also get a traction mode there too. If I'm honest, the one thing I feel about this car is that it doesn't really have all that much of a sporty feeling to it. Yes, it is quick, but even in the Cupra mode, it's kind of surprising there's no augmented or synthesized engine sound. And I know we often criticize cars for that, you know, for having these fake sounds, but it doesn't matter what version you go through, there's no artificial sound. Obviously, yes, there's an external sound at lower speeds to alert pedestrians and cyclists and things like that, but there's no real sort of, well, zazz with this. Even in its Cupra mode, it goes a little bit quicker, and you know, it does give you quite a bit of a shove right away when you put your foot down. It is a more kind of, I guess, slightly violent feeling when you just plant the foot down, whereas in the comfort modes it's obviously a much more relaxed and more linear acceleration, so there's a bit more urgency there. But this car doesn't feel especially quick, you know, certainly in the way that it might warrant the VZ badge. But of course, this is a bit of a family trait we're starting to see, because when we drove the Skoda Octavia Coupe RS version, one thing that we all came back from driving that was that we didn't feel that it warranted having the RS badge on it. And I'm kind of thinking the same thing with this. Yes, it is quick, but it's not overly sporty. You know, it doesn't feel special in the way, like, you know, a GTI feels more special than a regular Golf. This is quicker and it's got some nice spec, but it doesn't feel like a really sporty version. Now, Cupra is a sporty brand, and that's very true in terms of its design and how it looks, and how this car rides, I've no issue with it at all. It's a bit predictable. If you've driven an ID5 GTX or you've driven the Enyaq, it's not going to drive all that differently from those. It does feel quite planted on the road. It feels quite sure-footed. It does feel, you know, quite composed in that sense. It has a maturity to how it handles, and a nice degree of predictability too. The steering has an okay amount of weight and feel to it, but as I was saying, it's just doesn't quite have that extra little bit of sparkle that I would have hoped it had, that would have differentiated it from all these other electric cars that it's going to compete against. But if I park that kind of performance and, you know, sporty driving aside and just take this as it is, yes, it is quite a nice car to drive. Okay, the range, 512 kilometers or thereabouts, depending on specification exactly. It's not bad. You're probably not going to see that. Even earlier today, we had the battery was at 84% and it was showing around 380 kilometers. At the moment, it's got 78% battery charge, and it's giving me a predicted 327 kilometers of range. Maybe for some people that's enough, But, you know, there's a few other aspects where it kind of misses out on stuff, where it feels like this was a car that was perhaps designed a few too many years ago. It only has 11 kilowatt AC charging, and I know most people only have at best 7.4 kilowatt charging at home, but there are a lot of newer electric vehicles and current electric vehicles. If you take a look at, for example, what Smart are doing with the Smart 3, they add 22 kilowatt AC charging as standard. And for me, having fast AC charging is really a bit of a game changer. It's the thing that I would look for in an EV. I want a car that, okay, yes, rapid charging is good, and this at 135 kilowatt isn't bad, especially if it does, as Cupra's R&D people tell me, maintain a higher rate of charge for a longer period. That's why, for example, this doesn't have the same peak 185 kilowatt that the Born VZ has. But still, only having 11 kilowatts these days in 2024 going into 2025, how much more would it have cost Cupra to give us a 22 kilowatt AC charger? I do wonder, and I do think it would have been a worthwhile investment for them to do it. Another worthwhile investment would have been to make the heat pump a standard item. Instead, it's optional, and again, that's one of those things that these days I think it's a little bit disappointing to see. One other thing that I do like is that Cupra has put paddles on the back of the steering wheel for adjusting the recuperation levels. And I know some people probably don't bother with it, but I love using this when I'm driving a car, because there are times, maybe if you're on a motorway and you're cruising and you want to just turn that off because you want to be able to coast, but I don't want to fiddle switching between different drive modes. So I like that I can adjust that depending on how I'm driving. If I'm going into the city, I'll dial it all the way up so I've got maximum recuperation, and then, as I said, vice versa, if I'm on the motorway, I just want it to sail and coast so I can lift off and cruise along without using anywhere near as much energy. So yes, I love that they've done that. And the steering wheel itself is a decent size. It's not too chunky, you know, it has a nice feel to it in your hands, and yeah, pretty good in that respect. I do wish they got rid of the haptic controls on the steering wheel though. That's one thing that is a little bit annoying, and even Volkswagen has gone back to using buttons on the Golf, well, at least on most of its Golf models. Point to point, this is a brisk, quick car. I don't really think most people need to have all that performance, but this is a car that many people are probably going to buy with their hearts more so than their heads. I mean, subjectively, it is a very good looking car. It does have a very design forward approach to it, and the interior is quite nice. It is pretty well made. Okay, there are a few little bits where it does feel a little bit cheap, but overall the design, if you're going to be sitting and spending time in here, it is nice, and more importantly, it's different from a lot of the other things that are out there. Okay, yes, they all have big touchscreens and things like that, but the way they've done this whole center console, these seats, they feel great. You know, it has enough of a change that it does stand out from certainly the rest of what happens and what's going on in its parent group of companies. If I were to buy one, I'd probably skip the VZ, if I'm honest, and just plumb for a regular Tavascan and maybe tick a few more boxes. And after all, if I'm only going to have rear wheel drive, I'm going to have slightly longer range, and even if I drop down an inch on the wheels, it's not going to have any negative impact on ride comfort, that's for sure. It's still more than quick enough, and both versions, whichever you choose, all-wheel drive VZ or the regular endurance model with the rear wheel drive, you still get 545 newton meters of torque. And as we all know with electric cars, it's that instantaneous torque, which is kind of what's so addictive and so fun about having an electric car. And obviously we're going to have to wait until we spend a little bit longer with the car to really gauge what it's like in terms of its true range and real efficiency. But even on a short blast today with the car on a variety of different roads, we're averaging, okay, a little bit higher than we would expect, 19.3 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. But we have been driving a little bit hard today and really exploring what the true potential performance of the Tavascan VZ is like. Obviously, over a longer trip, and maybe when you're not trying to exploit all of that performance all the time, that figure should improve. But so far today, that's what we've averaged. It's actually just dropped to 19.2. So, you know, there's definitely room for improvement there. And again, we'll wait until we have the car in Ireland for longer, where we can really live with it for a week or two and get a better idea of what the true range will be like. So that's our first drive review of the Cupra Tavascan. If you want to know more about the car, head over to our website. It's CompleteCar.ie. You'll find it linked in the description below, and it's a great resource for finding your next new car. Thanks for watching.